Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Din and Daf. This is Alana Steinhain, and we are going to talk about a discussion of how the rabbis resolve uncertainty. What I mean by this is there are so many examples of suffix. There are so many examples of uncertainty in halachic life. And Chazal, the rabbis talk a lot about those cases. And they offer some rules of thumb for how to deal with uncertainty. And I don't mean existential uncertainty, I mean legal uncertainty. So, for example, if I can't figure out if, I don't know, somebody committed murder or didn't commit murder, I have these judges, and the judges are going to work on the case, hear the facts of the case, they're going to judge, and we're going to follow the majority, for example, right? Or, for instance, if I see that a little kid is sitting next to food that was considered tahor, right? Food that was considered ritually impure, and little kid's hands. Assumption is little kid's hands are considered ritually impure, and I don't know if the kid touched the dough that's there. So how am I going to figure it out, right? Am I going to say to myself, well, maybe that dough before this kid ever came here, that dough we knew was tahor, so it has a legal presumption of tahara. Or maybe we'd say, well, most little kids, especially I see there's a little piece of bread or dough in this kid's hand already. Most little kids are going to touch things. So there's a statistical majority, likelihood, what we would call rove, statistical majority that the kid probably touched it. So maybe it is Tameh, right? So these are all things that, Chazal are playing in the arena of how do I establish some rules of thumb? Is it about status quo ante, meaning what we knew was the case, which we would call chazaka? Is it about rove? Is it about the majority, either a statistical majority of, statistically speaking, this is usually what happens, right? Or sometimes even a concrete majority, right? How many people say this person is innocent, right? How many judges say this person is innocent, etc. But what we see coming up in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah on Daf Lamed Dalet Amud Bet and Mem Amud Bet is a concern about the statistical minority. That is rare, and it's attributed to Rabbi Meir as a shita, as a halachic perspective. And I want to spend 2 weeks actually talking about it because it is so rare. This week, I want to try to analyze what's the logic behind Rabbi Meir saying, no, 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 I'm worried about the statistical minority also, right? When there's an uncertainty, even if the statistical majority points one way, if the statistical minority possibility points another, I'm worried about that. Is he just being strict? Is there some further logic there? And then next week, I want to talk about how Rishonim, how medieval commentators and decisors deal with the question of miut, of minority of cases, especially because so much of Jewish law ends up pushing in the direction of what's the majority statistic, right? And the Rishonim actually come up with a distinction between something called a miut hamatzui, a found or substantial minority, and a miut she'enu matzui, and an insubstantial, I think is the word, minority of cases. But we'll get to that, and there is a little bit of the DNA of that in this week. So we're going to look at the Shita of Rabbi Meir, the perspective of Rabbi Meir. Now let's jump in and see what this looks like in practice. Okay. So first of all, we have a Mishnah on Daf Mem Amud Bet that introduces to us a machloket between Rabbi Meir and Chachamim. Kol atzlamim asurim mipnei she'ein ne'avadin pa'am achat b'shana. Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says any statue, no matter what it looks like, is prohibited for a Jew to derive benefit from it, because we assume it's avodah zarah, because it is worshipped as avodah zarah once a year, or I would say at least once a year, right? But Chachamim omrim, and the sages say, no, eino asur ela kol sheyesh biado makel o tzipor or kadur. Only certain statues are worshipped as idolatry. They have to have in their hand either a staff or a bird or an orb. So the Gemara says, well, we're a little bit confused. What about those rest of those statues that Rabbi Meir says get worshipped as idolatry? Idin Avadin Pam Achat says the Pam Achat Bashana says the Gemara. If these things are worshipped once a year, all statues, my Tama Dirabanan, why are the rabbis saying that you can still derive benefit unless it has one of these three things in its hand? So Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, the explanations that the Amoraim give is no. Bimkomo shel Rabbi Meir, you have to understand, here was the reality. Where Rabbi Meir lived, Hayu avdin ota pam achad bashana. Every statue, no matter what it was holding in his hand or not holding in its hand, would be worshipped as idolatry once a year. And Rabbi Meir, the Chayesh Lemiuta, Rabbi Meir, who's concerned about the minority of cases, and this city where he was, or village, or more likely, right, where he is concerned about the fact that they worship every statue there at least once a year. And therefore, Gazar Shar Mekomot Atuma Otomakom. He said, I'm going to make a decree on all villages, on all places, on all statues because of this minority case. Because who knows? Maybe they do worship, you know, all of the statues there, even if they're not holding an orb. But V'Rabbanan Delo Chayshei L'Miyuta, but Chachamim who don't actually care about the statistical minority, they say that's one city. Lo Gazru Shar Mekomot Otomakom. They're not ready to decree that all statues in all places are maybe they're worshipped because they're a minority of places and then say you can't derive benefit. So here's Rabbi Meir. Now, Rabbi Meir's shita is really interesting because you kind of look at it and you say, okay, so Rabbi Meir is just being machmer, right? He's just being a little bit, what's the word? Cautious, right? He's being strict, but he's being cautious just in case. And the truth is, people often go back to sort of the original perspective of Rabbi Meir, even though it's in a Breita that's quoted in Gemaras, and there actually is a Mishnah where Rabbi Meir seems to be also doing this, which we'll see in a few minutes. But it's drawn out the conversation in a good way. So in Yevamot, Samach Aleph Amud Bet, Yevamot 61b, we have a Breita. An underage boy, katan uktana, or an underage girl, lo cholton velo miyabmin. They cannot do chalitza and they cannot do yibum. Tivir Rabbi Meir. That's what Rabbi Meir thinks. Okay, look, we're talking about a time in the ancient world where kids would be married underage. Today, God forbid we marry a child underage, but that's what they did back then. And Rabbi Meir says, I'm sorry, if these children are underage, they can't do yibum and they can't do chalitza. Amr lo Rabbi Meir, so his colleague colleagues said to him, Yafa amarta shein choltzin. We get why you're saying they can't do chalitza. Ish k'tiv b'parsha, it's written, it says man in the Torah when it's talking about chalitza. Umakshin ish ali ish. And we basically say that just like it has to be a man, it has to be a woman, meaning they have to be adults. Elamai time ein miyabmin, but why not just let them do yibum? What's the difference? You're going to just wait till they're past bar and bat mitzvah for them to get married? Just get married anyway. That's what we do in our time. So his response is, Katan Shema Yimatse Saris, Kitana Shema Timatse Ailunit. What he's worried about is, look, I know that the majority of children grow up to be able to be fertile, but who knows, maybe these underage kids who haven't gone through puberty yet, maybe they'll be the minority case. Maybe the boy will be a eunuch, maybe the girl will be sexually immature, meaning they won't be able to be fertile. And what that means is, the only reason they're allowed to marry each other in the first place, remember, a brother-in-law and a sister-in-law are not allowed to marry each other. They're not allowed to sleep together. That is one of the arayot. It's one of the forbidden sexual relations. The only yotzei min haklal, the only exception is in the case of Yibum. Because what are they trying to do? They're trying to uphold the name of the brother who died. But these people can't have children. So they're not going to be able to uphold the brother who died, and therefore, v'nimtzu pogin be'erva. They will have violated Gilui Arayot. They would have violated sexual impropriety, a sexual sin. Now, this is very interesting because the majority of kids will grow up and be able to have children. But there is that statistical minority. And Rabbi Meir says, I am concerned about the statistical minority. Hold your horses. Wait until they get older. Make sure that they actually can have children and then give them yibum to each other if you want, right? So really interesting. But does Rabbi Meir have a parameter for this? Does he have a gvul? Does he have a place where he says, okay, listen, there's minorities and then there's minorities. Meaning I'm worried about the statistical minority, but maybe there's like a statistical minority that's so small, percentage-wise, that I'm not really concerned about it, even Rabbi Meir, right? So it happens to be that in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah on Daf Lamed Dalet Amud Bet, there is a discussion like that presents that Rabbi Meir says, look, or the Gemara says for him, I am choshesh l'miut. I am concerned about statistical minorities. But I am not choshesh, I am not concerned about miuta de miuta, a minority of a minority, meaning a statistical minority that's so small that it's insignificant. So here's the example. The Mishnah told us that Gvinat ben Onyaki, the cheese from a place called Beit Onyaki, was off limits, prohibited to be eaten, prohibited to derive benefit from it. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Reish Lakish says, Masru Gvinat Beit Onyaki. Why did they say that it's prohibited to derive benefit from it? Because most of the calves in that city are slaughtered for the purpose of idolatry. And then the Gemara says, wait. A few minutes ago, we suggested that the Mishnah might have followed Rabbi Meir. Why does it have to be the majority of calves? If the Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, it doesn't. My area Rov Agalim. Why do we have to say that the reasoning is that it's because the majority of calves are slaughtered for Avodah Zarah? Afilu miut nami. Why not even the minority of calves? Taha Rabbi Meir chaysh l'miuta. We said the Mishnah could follow Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Meir actually is concerned about the minority, right? So the Gemara says, well, hold on. That's not quite the case here. I amrit rov ika miut. If you said there is the majority is X and then the minority is Y. Ela I amrit miut. But if you said not rov agalim, but instead you say miut agalim, right? It's the majority. Notice, it didn't say the minority of animals. It's the minority of calves. Kema deika rov agalim de'enish chatin lavadah zarah. Because you would then have the majority of calves that are not slaughtered for avodah zarah. Ve'ikanami, and you also have shar behemot de'enish chatin lavadah zarah. You'd also have other animals that are not slaughtered for avodah zarah, and it's possible that the cheese was made in their stomachs too. And now suddenly, when you say it's the minority of calves, habale miuta de miuta, you now have a minority among a minority, right? You have a minority of calves, and the calves, I should say, a minority of calves, and the calves are among many other animals as well. A minority of a minority. Umiuta de miuta lo chayish Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is not worried about every little statistic, right? And I think this is really interesting because it does tell you that even if he is deciding to be machmir, even if he is deciding to be careful, there's a limit. Okay? There's a limit. So now I actually want to try to understand, is he really just being, machmir, or is there some logical way that this fits in to the general way that Chazal think about uncertainty cases? Now, I mentioned before that sometimes we might think about resolving uncertainty using what we call status quo ante. Using, well, what did we know about the status quo before this literally status quo ante, right? What was the status of this before, right? What is the legal presumption about this, right? You're walking around the world, you've never been pregnant. The chazaka about you, the legal presumption about you, is that you're not pregnant. Okay? You are walking around the world pregnant. The legal presumption about you, when I see you 12 months later, no, that's a bad idea. The legal presumption about you within that time is that you're pregnant, right? So that's one way of thinking about how we resolve an uncertainty. I don't know whether this dough is tahor or tameh right now. Well, what did I know about it last I checked? It was tahor, so maybe it's still tahor. Another way of resolving things is through the rove. And here I'm going to say rove not as the concrete majority, how many of the judges, but what we call a ruba deleta kaman, a rove that's not in front of us, meaning a statistical majority, right? And when we talk about a statistical majority, we're basically saying, look, what usually happens in cases like this, right? What's the way of the world? We're going to follow the way of the world, right? And generally speaking, when Chazal have a status quo ante versus a way of the world, a legal presumption versus a rove, they follow the rove. Okay. So let's see what Rabbi Meir thinks about all that. So the Mishnah in Tarot gives us the example that I mentioned of a little kid. Tinok shenimtza b'tzad ha'isa v'abatzek biyado. A kid is sitting next to a dough and is holding a piece of dough in their hand. Rabbi Meir mitaher. Rabbi Meir says, no problem, even though that kid hands are tameh. Rabbi Meir says, the dough in that pile next to the kid, still tahor, still pure. V'chachamim mitamim, and the sages, they say, no, that dough is tameh. Sheter chatinok l'tapech. Because, and I'm going to say it like this, rove tinokot, right? Most kids, and that's where the Gemara is going to put it, most kids would touch the Isa, would touch the dough. And so we assume this kid did. So yes, I understand. There was a chazaka, the dough was pure. That's what we knew about it. That was the presumption. But I have a little kid here sitting here holding a piece of dough. Most of the time, a kid is going to see a piece of dough and touch it. So we're going to assume that the rove, the majority, the statistical, most of the time, this is what would happen. The way of the world is going to be what my presumption was. Now, Rabbi Meir, however, says, no, I care about the statistical minority too. So the Gemara in Kiddushin, where it picks up this Mishnah from Tarot, says, my time at the Rabbi Meir. Why is Rabbi Meir saying this Isa, this dough, not the one that the kid is holding, the one next to him, is still tahor? Come on. Kasavar, he's thought to himself, this is what Rabbi Meir thinks. Yes, it's true. Rove tinokot mitapchin. A statistical majority, you put kids in front of that nice, good-looking piece of dough, 9 out of 10 kids are going to touch the dough. It's true. But umiyot ein mitapchin. But a minority of children will not. Ve'isa b'cheskat tara omedet. And don't forget, that dough has something else going for it. The legal presumption about it, the status quo ante, is that it was tahor. So, actually, smoch miyuta lechazaka. I want you to put together these two factors. Number one, some kids won't touch the dough. So who says this kid touched the dough? A minority of kids won't touch the dough. Who says this kid touched the dough? Plus, there's already a chazaka. There's already a legal presumption that this thing was tahor. So you know what happens? Put those two together, and they can gang up against the rove, the statistical majority, that most kids would touch it, and thus make it tameh. And no, itra leruba. That rove, you've nicked it. It's not as powerful anymore. Essentially, I want us to notice what Rabbi Meir did here. Rabbi Meir didn't say, he's not being machmir. He's not being overly cautious. The opposite. He's saying he's saying that he's saying that dough is still tahor, right? Tahora. He's saying it's still pure, right? He's being makil here, actually. But his logic is that it's not just that if something is a minority, I care about it and I notice it. He says what's happening here is the minority and the legal presumption about the status of the object are ganging up together to beat the majority. So there's a logic here, right? There's a logic here that actually fits into the general discussion of how Chazal talk about how to resolve uncertainty. So what about the rabbis? They don't care about that minority of kids who might not touch it? Well, v'Rabbanan, miuta kemandelete dami. They say a statistical minority, let's do it again. A statistical minority is as if it's nothing, non-existent. We don't care. It can't help the chazaka. It can't help the presumption. It's non-existent. And guess what? Ruba v'chazaka, if you have a majority versus a presumption, majority of kids who would touch it and thus make it tameh, versus presumption that it's tahor because that's the way it was before this kid ever got here. Ruba adif, we say the majority wins. You can't just go by status quo ante. You can't go by the last thing you knew. You have to go by what's the way of the world, right? So that's their machloket. So what happens here? the miut, the statistical minority, gangs up with the chazaka, the legal presumption, to beat the rove, to beat the statistical majority. But I think it's likewise quite interesting that there's at least another example where it doesn't beat the statistical majority, but it actually just leaves you in limbo, according to Rabbi Meir. Let's take a look at the example. Okay. So there's a Mishnah that's really, it's trying to figure out, a woman, is she going to have to, I'll say it like this, a woman whose husband died and had no kids, right? She has to do Yibum. But what if she's not sure if her husband had no kids? Take a look. Mishnah says in Yibamot, Ha'isha shalach ba'ala v'tzarata l'midinat hayam. A woman whose husband and rival wife, because remember, still in the age of polygamy. Again, God forbid we do that today, but that's what they did, right? So her rival wife and her husband went, to some far off place. V'amrula meit ba'alich, and she was told her husband died. So I don't know if the rival wife had a kid with that husband. She doesn't have to do yibum. She doesn't have to do chalitza, this woman, because there's a child, right? But if the rival wife didn't have children, then she does have to either do chalitza or yibum. So what is this woman supposed to do? So she's in limbo, says the Mishnah. Lo tinaseh, she can't get married to somebody else in case she actually is going to have to do either yibum or chalitza. Velo tityabem, but she also can't do yibum with her brother-in-law. Ad shetida shema me'uberet hitzarata, until she knows that the rival wife is not pregnant. Right? Wow, it's kind of an intense case. This woman, sadly, is stuck in limbo. So she's in limbo. Now, it's an interesting thing. Let's just think about what the possibilities are of resolving this uncertainty, right? So on the one hand, when her husband dies and she doesn't know that he has any children, right? Meaning the default, the assumption is she's going to have to do Yibam or Chalitza. That's her chazaka. That's the legal presumption about her, right? Is it possible that maybe they had a child? Maybe. So now tell me, is it rove, is it majority of the time that this other woman would probably have a kid with him? And imagine they're living out their marital life somewhere else. This poor woman's been ditched. They're living out their marital life somewhere else. I think we would say the rove, the majority of the time, statistical majority, that lady probably got pregnant at some point and had kids with him, right? Or at least got pregnant, right? But, or I shouldn't say that, and had kids with him, right? So here you have maybe the presumption that she actually does have to do Yibum. But the rove, the majority, is that she doesn't, because this rival wife probably had a kid with him. And we say rove beats out. So how come the Mishnah is saying that she's in limbo, that she can't get married to somebody else, and she also can't do Yibum until she finds out for sure what happened, right? So that's the first case. And hint, hint, the Gemara is going to say this Mishnah follows Rabbi Meir, and we're going to explain why. Then you have a second case. Haitala Chamot. Let's say her husband has no brothers, right? You're not going to do Yibum or Chalitza if there's no brother. But it turns out her mother-in-law is overseas. So maybe her mother-in-law had a baby and now she does have a brother-in-law. So the Mishnah says, no, you have to worry about it. You don't have to worry about it. Yatstam le'ah, if the mother-in-law left pregnant, chosheshet, she does have to worry about it. And then Rabbi Yeshua says, she doesn't have to worry about it. But I'm most interested in this first line of if she has a mother-in-law, she doesn't have to worry about it. Now I want to think again, how does everything work here? So you do have a chazaka. I think the chazaka is that she doesn't need Yibum, right? That's the legal presumption because she doesn't have a brother-in-law. It's only you. The onus is on somebody else to tell me that I have a brother-in-law. My whole life I've known I don't have a brother, right? So that's her chazaka. And what's the rove? Well, to be honest, I think the rove also says she doesn't have a brother-in-law. Because think about it, even if her mother-in-law got pregnant, who says she had a boy? Right? If you think about the statistical majority of births, it's either girl or, God forbid, a miscarriage. Having a boy, statistical minority, right? Huh, interesting. So it sounds like in a Chosheshet, she doesn't have to worry. Now, is that Rabbi Meir too? Are we worried about the statistical possibility of him, of the mother-in-law having a boy, even though that's a statistical minority? Let's see. So the Gemara is trying to figure out, like, how do we understand this, right? So first of all, the Gemara says it's all Rabbi Meir. And Rava explains, let me tell you the difference between the two cases. And I think this is like the capstone of trying to understand the logic of Rava. Okay. Just look, Resha, in the case of the husband and a rival wife went to a foreign country, right? We say chazaka liyibum, right? The presumption is that I'm going to have to do yibum because I don't know that my husband has a child. But viruba l'shuk. But the majority, the way of life is that he probably had a kid with that other woman. And we say, v'chazaka lo adif kiruba. And a chazaka does not override the rove, right? Meaning that's, but we also don't say that she can then just go get married to anybody else, which is what probably Chachamim would say. But why don't we say it? Because not we. Rabbi Meir wouldn't say she can just go get married. Why? Ba'aiti mi'uta de mapilot. Because there is a possibility, there is a statistical minority possibility that this rival wife got pregnant but sadly miscarried. And take that and smoch l'chazaka and add that onto the presumption that this first woman needs to do yibum because she doesn't know that her husband hasn't had a child until now. Vahavle palgo palga. And now we're up to a half and half situation. Lo tinaseh v'lo tityabem. She's stuck in no person's land. She can't do either. Now I want you to notice what's happening here is, unlike the case with the child, where Rabbi Meir says, no problem. There's a chazaka, there's a presumption that this Isa, that this dough is tahor. And it can combine with a minority of cases where a kid wouldn't touch the Isa in order to say, nah, it's still tahor. Even though in the majority of cases, kids would touch it. No, it overrides that. Here, it doesn't override. Bringing in the mute, it doesn't override. What it does is it creates a seesaw effect where we are in limbo. Because yes, it's true. There's a chazaka going in the direction of she should just be able to do yibum now if she wants. And there's a rove going in the direction of she should just be able to get married to whomever she wants. And the truth is, usually we would want to say the rove wins. Let her go get married. The assumption is he's with that rival wife. They had a kid, and that's it. Shalom Yisrael. We say, but because there's a statistical possibility that she actually, God forbid, miscarried, then we're sorry. We're back to you might have to do yibum. So now you're stuck, sadly, trying to wait to figure out, was there a baby in there, in Medina Tayam, or isn't there a baby in Medina Tayam? So why is it that in one case for Rabbi Meir, the miyut helps override alongside the chazaka, override the rove, and in this other case, the miyut plus the chazaka, what it does is it just leaves her in no person's land. That's the stuff of Rishonim to try to figure it out. But suffice it to say, what I want you to see is that Rabbi Meir has a logic to him, which is not just about being machmir. The logic is that in general, chazaka and a rove go head to head. And what consideration of the miyut does is the miyut says it can combine with the chazaka to win. or at least to make the stakes even. What about the second case with the mother-in-law? So we say, well, we want to tell you something. In the second case with the mother-in-law, like we said, chazaka l'shuk, because she has had no brother-in-law until now, she's presumed that she can just marry anyone she wants, and there's no yibum or chalitza. And veruba l'shuk. And the majority of cases, even if her mother-in-law had a baby now, it would be either a baby girl who she couldn't marry, or it would be she couldn't marry, it wouldn't be yibum, or it would be a nafel. It would be, God forbid, a miscarriage. So both the chazaka and the rove are going in the same direction, right? Vahavale zcharim, the possibility of her having a baby boy right now, that's a miyuta de miyuta. Now that becomes, because it's going against both the chazaka and the rove, we consider it a miyuta de miyuta. It's in that same category of no, this is insignificant. Umiyuta de miyuta lo chayish Rabbi Meir, right? And the uh, statistically insignificant something. Rabbi Meir doesn't care about it, right? So notice Chazaka and Rove when they gang up against the mute can't stand it, has nothing, no legs to stand up. So it's interesting because you have these cases of, is it the Chazaka plus the mute that beats the Rove? Is it the Chazaka plus the mute that at least is equivalent? What if the Chazaka, it doesn't, it's not on the same side as the mute, but it also doesn't totally undermine the mute, right? So the Tosfot actually say, says that which we suggest that you need the chazaka, the legal presumption, plus the mute. Lo ba'inan hachi, ela shalote chazaka misaya talarov. Says you don't actually need that. You just need to make sure that it's not a situation where both the chazaka and the rove are against the mute. Because if both the chazaka and the rove are against the mute, the azavi mute to mute, then we call it statistically insignificant, right? So it seems like you need either the chazaka plus the mute in order to beat the rove, or the chazaka plus the mute in order to be equal to the rove. And this is all only according to Rabbi Meir. Or you need the chazaka to be completely neutral in some way in order for it to work. Now, I do want to say, I would be remiss if I didn't say that this case of a woman giving birth to a katan, a child, somewhere in Medina Tayam, when this other woman now might be waiting for Yibum, right? I couldn't believe this, that I've had conversations with people this year where if people get married and a woman's brother-in-law is a katan, is a minor, there is no provision made for her not to have to wait for him to grow up should she ever need chalitza. And I'm going to say that's something we need to deal with and figure out, because you can't have a woman in a situation like that waiting for chalitza for years until a minor grows up. So that's maybe for another time. But either way, great learning with you. We have a little bit of logic of miyut that is not just stringency. And next week we'll deal with the Rishonim. Thank you, everybody.